Hey everybody, welcome to unit number 2. We are talking about the forgetting curve here. You can see I got my sleeves rolled up because it's time to do some real work. And you can see my dog, who, I don't know if you can see him, he's just kind of like staring at the door for some reason. What's up, Fozzie? You okay? What a weirdo. Anyways, let's get into Unit 2 where we're talking about the forgetting curve. Last unit, we talked about what is memory, and we looked at kind of some different examples of what memory could be like, and we talked about a few definitions and how it's measured. This unit is, we're going to move back into history and look at one of, actually I'm going to say we're going to look at not just one of the earliest, but the earliest memory researcher in psychology, and kind of look at a key finding that he discovered in the 1800s that is still true today and still widely practiced and taught. So, and that is also, if you didn't figure that out, is the forgetting curve. All right, so Herman Ebbinghaus is this guy. He's German, as his name might suggest. But this is 1885, which was a very, very, very long time ago, right? Probably before you were born. But the reason why I think 1885 is so interesting is because if you think about the origins of psychology, some people will trace it back to like 1870 something, you know, when they're talking about Wilhelm Wundt, who was also a German guy, and his experimental laboratory in Leipzig. The thing that I think is so cool about Herman Ebbinghaus is that he wasn't part of that clique. He wasn't part of that laboratory. He was just kind of like this researcher doing his own thing across the way in a different city at a different university, just doing his own thing. And he ultimately would write a book called Memory, or sometimes it's translated to On the Contributions to Memory. And it was published in 1885. Translated into English in 1913, so 30 years later, and it wasn't really until I would say the 60s that the 1960s, that his work was rediscovered and kind of like people realized how forward-thinking he was in the way that he talked about memory. So in some ways, whenever you do the reading for this unit, I'm going to have you read a chapter or two from Ebbinghaus. It's really interesting because in some ways it feels a little bit more modern than the way that George Miller wrote about it. Because whenever George Miller wrote about it in 1956, he was kind of coming at it from decades of behaviorism, right? Like we talked about how like behaviorism was kind of the primary perspective in experimental psychology at that time. What Ebbinghaus put together was before all that. It was before even Pavlov's dogs from the Soviet Union made such huge waves in classical conditioning. That's how old this stuff is. And one other really interesting thing is that a lot, or actually I'm going to say almost all of his work was done alone. And what I mean by that isn't just that he didn't have collaborators or co-authors. I mean like he used himself as a participant. And if you take in Research Methods 1, you know that's a big no-no. You're not allowed to do that, right? You're not allowed to just have one participant and that participant also be the researcher. So one of the things as we kind of go through this is that I want you to kind of be skeptical of and be critical of is thinking about, is this okay that he's the only participant? And if not, why? But also, if you don't think it would change the results, why? I think either way, it kind of opens up for an interesting discussion because this is before the APA, right? This is before there were any kind of standard set for psychological research. So the way that he tested himself as a participant is that he would train himself to remember a bunch of nonsense syllables. These nonsense syllables were always a consonant, vowel, consonant. So you have these 3 letters and they always follow that same kind of pattern. Consonant, vowel, consonant. Now why did he do this? Why did he test himself on words like lur and fub and wep and these other kinds of words that don't really mean anything? Why is that? Well, because you can imagine if he had these words, right? these two words right here, they follow the same kind of structure. They're 3 letters, consonant, vowel, consonant. But cat and dog, you can imagine what those things look like in your head, right? So that might give you an advantage if you're trying to retrieve that information compared to if you're trying to remember lur or fub or wep. So the reason why he's using nonsense syllables is really to try to reduce the impact that previous exposures might have on his memory and his recall. And so that's what I mean. Like, that's, in my opinion, that's really forward-thinking stuff. That's, a really interesting kind of approach, and something that we absolutely still do now in psychology, is that we really, when we're doing memory research, we really try to take into account things like, does this word, is it emotionally charged? That might affect your ability to recall it. Or maybe this word could be super familiar to you, and if so, that could affect your recall of it. All right, and here's the book that I was talking about, Memory, from 1885. This, and also this photo of Ebbinghaus. There are only 2 photos of Ebbinghaus. They pretty much look exactly the same. The other one is basically his body's turned slightly differently, but is almost kind of, he's got the same haircut, same beard and everything. It's a great beard. I think we all can agree. And also, check out that eyewear. I would not mind it at all if those came back into fashion. That would be really cool. And I say that as somebody who doesn't wear eyeglasses, so I can't imagine how annoying it might be to constantly have to grab your your glasses by the bridge. It just looks cool to me. All right, so the way that he would test himself is very simple. And he had a couple of different variations of it, but this is one of them, which is that he would try to remember that list of nonsense words like we saw here. He would give himself a little bit of a delay, and then he would test himself again. We're going to see this structure used, the structure of memory test used throughout the semester. And he didn't call it this at the time, but we would now call this something like you have a study phase where you're learning that info. Then you have let's just say that this is a delay, and that delay could be a couple of minutes, could be a couple hours, could be a couple of days, could be a few years. And then we have the test phase. And so what Ebbinghaus is doing is that he is, in his study phase, trying to remember the entire list of words. He's going to give himself a delay, and then he's going to test himself and try to repeat what those words are. Now, if he didn't get 100%, he would go back to the study phase, and he would try to relearn that stuff all over again. Then he'd give himself the same delay, and then he would test himself. And if he didn't get 100% that second time, he would go back to the beginning, study that list again, give himself the same delay, then test himself. And he would basically see, how long does it take for me to really learn the entire list of words here? So how much can you remember, and does that eventually change over time? How much of that changes over the course of this delay? Because you can imagine if you had a list of words, let's say 5 words, and your delay was 5 seconds, you're probably going to be okay. You're probably going to remember all those words, right? But it gets really interesting when we increase that beyond, let's say, beyond 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, we start to get some interesting results. So let's take a look at what Ebbinghaus found. This is his big contribution that is still taught today that I teased at the beginning of this video. This is the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is something that Ebbinghaus found time and time again as he was testing himself. Essentially, minutes after he studied a list, even if that delay was a minute or 2 minutes, what he found is that he forgot most of those words in as short as 2 minutes. That a lot of it was gone pretty much right away. But what he found is that as time went on, the amount that he forgot, the rate of that forgetting slowed down over time. And this is kind of a weird way to think about it because I'm using forgetting as a dependent variable and it doesn't feel natural to do that. So let me break down exactly what we mean here. And I want you to think about how this applies to your own life, specifically how this applies to what you learn in your classes, or and how you can apply it to testing. All right, so let's say that, and so this is idealized data. This is not exactly what Ebbinghaus found, but this is just kind of like a simulation to kind of prove, to make it look like a fancy graph. But the premise is exactly the same. So what you're looking at here on the y-axis is accuracy, so how much of it did you retain, and then on the x-axis you're looking at time. So let's say that you study something. Let's say that you study some flashcards and you're tested immediately after you study that with your flashcards. You're probably going to do pretty good. You're probably going to hang around perfect whenever you test yourself, and then you immediately test yourself with no delay. You're going to do great. But let's say that you study up some flashcards and then 24 hours later, then you take the test. What Ebbinghaus found is that whenever you have a full day between that study phase and that testing phase, that your accuracy, or what you retain, has dropped roughly 50%. So you have, and actually that seems to be more like 60%, or even in some cases as much as 66%. But again, for the sake of demonstration, we're going to keep it simple with this figure. So within 24 hours, you've already forgotten the majority of that list. But here's the really interesting thing. If we wait another 24 hours, so we go from that first day to the second day, that drop now, so from here down to here, that is, what, 50% down to, let's call that 35%. So that's a 15% drop. So that is a huge difference. In 24 hours, you forget 50, and then in the next 24 hours, you don't forget the same amount, right? Because if you did, then you would remember 0%, right? Because you'd remember half of it, and then you'd forget that half, and you'd be left with 0%. That's not what happens. What happens is that you forget a little bit within the next 24 hours. But let's say another 24 hours goes by, and so now we're looking at the difference of this and this, which is going to be about, so I said that was what, 35, and that this is about 25, so it's going to be about 10% decrease now. And then if we were to move from day 3 to day 4, you can see again that's going to move from about 25 to about 18%, which is about, sorry, I drew that bad. That's going to be about a 7%. And so what you're seeing is that the rate at which we are forgetting things is slowing down over time, so that ultimately what you're left with is stuck with you. Okay, so if we were to look at, for example, what we remember from day 6 to day 7 is pretty flat, right? There's not a whole lot of change here. So what does that mean? How does that apply to your daily life? If you think about the classes you took last semester, right? You don't remember a whole lot of it, maybe. That's okay. Unless it was cognitive psychology or sensation perception or research methods 2, and you took it with me, you better remember 100% of that stuff. But if you think about what you took last semester, that's been more than 7 days ago, right? That's been over a week ago. And so by this point, what you remember from that class is probably going to be what you remember a week from now, and also a month from now. So a month from now, if I asked you, hey, what do you remember about social psychology? It's probably going to be the same information today as it will be next week, and then the week after that, because how much you forget has slowed down so much that pretty much with what you remember now is going to be the stuff that sticks with you. That's going to be the stuff that endures with you. And if you want to, you can see this as a very, very pessimistic thing, right? Because what I'm arguing is that what you've learned, right, from your classes, that you're only going to remember on a good day about 1/10 of that information. You're going to forget a lot of that. And so you're only going to remember about 1/10 of whatever you took in your class. So that is really upsetting for me as a professor. I want you to remember every single thing that I say. I want you to remember every single pause that I say in this video. Obviously, I'm just kidding. But that's a pretty hard reality to think about, right? That whenever you go and you learn something and you spend all this time studying, that within 6 months, you're going to have forgotten a lot of it. But that's just the nature of human memory. But the things that you remember are generally going to be the most important things, the most interesting things, the most emotional things. There's a good reason why the stuff that sticks with you does stick with you. Good chance that you don't remember all the boring stuff. You remember the stuff that is important to you, that is relevant to you. And we'll talk about why that is in a future chapter that's coming up when we talk about explicit memory. Alright, so that was a very long-winded way of talking about the forgetting curve. So what I'm saying here is, number one, you can guarantee that within a short time frame, you're going to forget a lot of what you just studied. Which means that if you're preparing for an exam, you want to over-prepare because you can be sure, you can be certain that you're going to forget a lot of it. That's just the nature of human memory. But, for example, this is why it's so good and so helpful to study early, and why all of your teachers tell you to study early and not the day of. Because if you study early, let's say I study a week early, I'm going to remember the important pieces, right? If I don't study again before the exam, which would be disastrous, that would be a bad idea. But if I study early, I'm going to remember 10% of all that information. And then if I study the night before and I remember an additional 50% of that, then boom, I'm now remembering at least 65%, or something like that, percentage of that information. So studying early, studying frequently, doing it, repeating it, does have a huge benefit on your memory because you can be sure that you're going to forget a good piece of it. You can thank Ebbinghaus for that. He's the one that discovered this. All right, so I just pointed all this stuff out, so I'm not going to go over this slide. This is the article that I was going to ask y'all to read for this unit, but honestly, it is quite boring, and I think it's interesting in concept, but not all that interesting to actually read. That basically, I asked you to think about critically, does it matter that Ebbinghaus was using himself as his only participant, right? It seems like that could be very biased. But Ebbinghaus was sneaky. He was sneakily smart about this because he chose words that would not be relevant to him. So in a way, he was picking out words that had no meaning to him, no personal relevance to him. And so he was essentially trying to be as unbiased as possible. So these three guys, these Dutch guys from the Netherlands, they went through and they tried to replicate Ebbinghaus's methods. They took his book and they followed all the procedures to the letter. They did it as accurately and as faithfully as possible. And what they found is essentially the same thing Ebbinghaus did. So this figure right here, this is Ebbinghaus's typical results. This is the forgetting curve. It just doesn't look like a forgetting curve because they transform the x-axis so that it is logarithmic, and so it's a decelerating function instead of a linear thing. Y'all know. I think y'all know what I'm talking about. They changed the scales just to make it a little bit more interpretable, so it makes it a linear thing instead of a logarithmic thing. But it's the same. But this is essentially the same thing I just showed you. So this is Ebbinghaus's raw data, and so we see that that deceleration. If we look at these Dutch guys, Mack, Seitz, and Droos, basically the same kind of function. This same kind of decelerating function that happens at almost exactly the same speed that Ebbinghaus predicted over 100 years ago. So what I'm saying is that even though Ebbinghaus's methods were kind of wacky, they still hold up. You can replicate them. So if you are taking research methods too, or you're going to soon, tell your professor that you're going to do your study with just you as the participant and see what they say. And if they don't like it, say like, well, hey, Ebbinghaus did it and they were able to replicate it. And let me know what your instructor says. Probably don't. And also, importantly, if you do that, do not tell them that I told you to do that. All right. So another thing that Ebbinghaus found here is something called savings. Sometimes people call this relearning. I think relearning is kind of comes with a lot of baggage to it, so I wouldn't. Let's just call it savings. That what Ebbinghaus found is that after you forget something, it's actually much easier to remember it the second time around, to relearn it. Okay, so what does that mean? Imagine, for example, that you thinking again about a class you took last semester. Let's say that you took social psychology, and then now you don't really remember all that much from that class. If you were to go back into that class and take it again, I can guarantee that you're going to be going through that book, that chapter, and there's going to be a lot of moments where you're like, oh yeah, I do remember this. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. And you're going to learn that information faster the second time than the first time you did it. So what Ebbinghaus found is that when you're trying to relearn this stuff, it always happens faster with multiple exposures. So even though you think that you have forgotten that information and you can't recall any of those words, some trace of those words are still in there because you learn it faster the second time around, which suggests that that information's in there floating around somewhere, right? So even though you've forgotten that information, traces of it are still able to be retrieved. That's what he means by savings. And that called into question, well, what exactly do we mean then by forgetting? Because this suggests, what savings suggests is that that memory is still in there somewhere because it's so much faster to relearn it, all these traces. But why can't we access them? What does that mean then? When we forget something, apparently the implications and what we're going to see this semester isn't that that memory is gone from your brain. Is that it's temporarily inaccessible to your brain. And so there are other ways that we might be able to retrieve it. So there's probably been lots of times where you think you forget something, like let's say that you forget the definition of confirmation bias in one of your classes. And you're like, I have no idea what that is. I don't remember. And then you see the definition and you're like, oh yeah, I do remember this. And maybe you can even remember, and you could like write out the rest of the definition from memory. In that case, the concept of confirmation bias wasn't absent from your head. It's just that for a moment it was temporarily inaccessible and you needed something to help you retrieve it. You needed a retrieval cue. We'll talk about that later this semester. So, and I already talked about this, about the real world applications to this. It just basically means that knowing that the forgetting curve exists, that you can guarantee that you're going to forget a lot of stuff, which means that we should over-prepare for exams and we should over-prepare for interviews or whatever else you're trying to memorize things for. But it also means that whenever you forget something, that it's going to be faster for you to pick it up than it was the first time you learned something. So if it took you an hour to study for the exam the first time, the second time is not going to take you an hour. It's going to be even faster. All right. And so this is just this figure is just trying to illustrate the importance of reminders and the importance of kind of checking in on those memories. So like let's say that you're in a class and you're learning from a lecture just like you are now. You can guarantee in that first day you're going to forget a lot of it, which is why you should, maybe you email yourself a reminder about that. It's about something that you learned, a tricky concept from that. I don't know if you know on Westfield's email that you can schedule emails to be sent to yourself. So you could be like, hey, send myself a reminder of the forgetting curve. So you're reminding yourself, or maybe you set a reminder on your phone, or maybe you come by during office hours to talk about it. All of these things can help you remember what you may have forgotten, but also you can see that with each repetition, that forgetting curve is shallower and shallower and shallower, meaning if you want something to stay with you, then maybe you should try this multiple exposures. All right. This forgetting curve that Ebbinghaus found, to my knowledge, has been demonstrated on every single species that has been tested on. And I used to be a comparative psychologist, which means that I've already mentioned this before, that I worked with non-humans. Pigeons were the animals that I worked with. And I was very, very interested in looking at pigeon memory and which that sounds like a nonsense sentence, doesn't it? Imagine somebody comes up to you and just says, I enjoyed measuring pigeon memory. But anyways, so I was very interested in like other non-human species. What do they remember and how do they remember it? And it does seem to be the case that for every single species that's been tested, that same kind of forgetting curve happens, where the longer the delay is, the less they have forgotten about it, or the more slowly they forget about that information. So just like it is for us, it's also true for non-humans. It's just that for the most part, their forgetting curves are much decelerated. So it would be something more like this instead of something like that. They're going to forget more quickly than we do. But a lot of human research, a lot of memory research is specifically about humans. And we're only going to look at a couple of non-human papers this semester. But it's just really interesting that this turns out to be not just true for humans, but true for most species. Ebbinghaus found one last thing that I want to tell you about in his experiments, and that is what we call the primacy and the recency effect. And you may have heard of this before because I think most people probably talk about it in their Psych 101 class. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's just me. But sometimes people, they come to class already knowing about the primacy effect and the recency effect. What that is if you're trying to learn a list of grocery items, for example, let's say that you're asked to go to the grocery store and pick up 10 different things. And if you try to do it all by memory, good luck. But if you try to do it all by memory, what you're going to find is that you're going to remember the first few pieces of that list, and you're going to remember the last few items on that list, but the ones you're likely to forget are the ones that are right there in the middle. That is the primacy effect, which is when we're talking about things that are early in that list. The recency effect is whenever we're talking about things late in that list. And then the things that are in the middle, we tend to forget. This is also known as the serial position effect. So if you are looking for this on Google Scholar or whatever, you'll also hear it called this, because I think people want it to sound fancier. But this is an example of the serial position effect, where here, this is again hypothetical data in this particular case, where we are looking at the likelihood that you've remembered something. So up here you have higher accuracy, down here you have lower accuracy, and then here we have the position of the item in the list, starting with 1 and then ending on, let's say, 15 or so. We're going to remember 1, 2, and 3 in that list, and we're going to remember 13, 14, and 15 in that list. But the ones that we're likely to forget are the ones that kind of hang out in the middle. And for different people in different species and different parameters, those can kind of shift. For some people, depending on the stimulus, they can have larger primacy effects and less recency effects, or it could be switched vice versa. And this particular data set, which comes from, I think, the 70s, the researchers here found a little bit of a primacy effect, a very strong recency effect, though. And the article that I'm going to be having you read is going to look at recency specifically in a interesting population. I'll put it that way. All right. So I want to close out this video lecture by kind of talking a little bit about why we forget and how we forget. And this is one of those things where, like, we'll be talking about what's referred to as decay a good bit this semester. We're going to be talking about decay and its sister interference. So decay and interference are kind of these two processes that work in tandem to help us forget things. So let's talk about decay, also known as transience. Transience, you can think of this as like a memory deteriorating over time. I'm not going to say that it completely goes away, because oftentimes there's going to be remnants of it somewhere in your consciousness, somewhere in your memory. But don't think of this necessarily as... and actually, I should take a step back. That transience, don't think of that specifically as decay. Think of it as more, it's actually more like interference. So I'll talk about transience first, then I'll tell you about decay in a little bit. So transience is kind of like whenever you overwrite something. So like, let's say you're transferring some files in your computer, and it asks you like, do you want me to overwrite this file because it has the same name? And you got to be careful though, right? Because sometimes if those are very different files, you might overwrite something that's important to you. That's essentially what interference is, where you have these memories that are interfered with, that they are corrupted in some way. So you can think of it as like you have some kind of experience that is going to corrupt a memory that you already have, perhaps. So this is a type of forgetting that, like, if you were to remember, you have a memory for something, and then after a while it's gone, and you don't know how to access it. That's what we're talking about here. So here is a quick example. So some of you may know this individual. This is Dr. Camilleri, and he is your advisor. You walk in and you say, hello, my name is Becky, and he says, hi, you can call me Joe. And then 10 weeks later, whenever you go in to meet with him again, you're like, hey, what's your name again? You probably wouldn't say that because that would be kind of embarrassing. But you might not know, and that's kind of concerning. So what happens here? There's kind of two explanations for why exactly we can't remember what this name is. And those two explanations are decay and interference. So what happened here? Let's talk about interference first. With interference, what we're looking at is a memory that is overriding a different memory. And this can happen in two different ways, in two different directions, where we can have an old memory is overriding and corrupting a new memory, which is called proactive interference. So proactive, you can think of it as like it's proactive, so it's moving forward into the future and corrupting a new memory. Or we can have retroactive interference, which is when it's just the opposite, when a new memory corrupts an old memory. And you can probably think of lots of examples of this if you think about it. Like, for example, let's talk about retroactive interference. Your social psychology class. I don't know why I keep bringing that one up, but let's say that you don't remember it super well. Is that because you've learned a lot of things in the meantime, and those new things that you've learned have kind of covered up what you learned in social psychology? If so, that is retroactive interference. The new information that you're learning right now is interfering with old memories. Proactive interference, on the other hand, is the opposite. And my favorite example, I don't know if y'all can relate to this. I hope you can, because it happens to me all the time. Let's say that you go to a grocery store that you go to all the time, right? The first time you go there and you walk out after you've parked, you parked, you go do your grocery shopping, you come back to the parking lot, there's a good chance you know exactly where you parked and you go straight there. But if you're like me and you've been living in the same town for a couple of years, going to that same grocery store, for 100 times or whatever, there are times where you will park, you will get out of the grocery store, and you'll stop and you'll be like, I have no idea where I parked. I think I parked over here, and you walk to a place where you know that you parked before, but it's the wrong one. In that case, the old memory for you parking is interfering with the current memory of you parking, and that's an example of proactive interference. So let's say that you're talking with your advisor. He tells you your name is Joe. His name is Joe, and then sometime in the meantime, you meet somebody whose name is Ken, and maybe they look kind of similar in that they have cool haircuts and they have distinctive glasses and they have some facial hair or whatever. And so the next time you see this person right here, maybe the first thing that pops into your mind is, I think his name is Ken. Maybe. In this case, what kind of interference is that? This would be an example of retroactive interference. Why? Because we have a new memory that is interfering with an old memory. And in fact, I want to take a screenshot of this just in case Dr. Camilleri sees the YouTube thumbnail of this, where I have like Ryan Gosling right here and a big X through his face, just to kind of see, does he send me an email and say like, hey Alex, what is up with that video you posted? If you're watching this, Dr. Camilleri, hello. So what happened in this case? Why is it that we forgot Dr. Camilleri's name? There are it could be interference that happens here, right? Which is what we just used to explain that. In that case, it could have been retroactive interference, and we'll talk more about those later in this semester. But it could also be because of what is known as decay. And decay is where memory is lost or corrupted because the neurons that are responsible for maintaining that particular memory or collection of memories has been destroyed or has been injured or has just died off through synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning is a biological process that just naturally kind of cleans and tries to make your neurons very efficient. So if you don't use neurons, they can lose some of their dendrites and become smaller and reach fewer neurons. That is known as decay. So let's say that you learn Dr. Camilleri's name, and then over that 10 weeks, maybe you get hit in the head in a field hockey game, or maybe you're playing volleyball and somebody spikes the ball into the back of your head or something like that, and all of a sudden you can't remember Dr. Camilleri's name. In this case, that is an example of decay, because what's happened is that the neurons responsible for maintaining that memory have been altered in some way. They've either died off, they've changed in a way that, well, I don't want to use the word change, that's too vague. Or it could be that they have been pruned away, it could be that they have been destroyed through injury. I was going to go with Dr. Speiler, Jack Speiler, as my example here, but I don't think he doesn't teach in person anymore, and so you may not have come across him in person, but you may have interacted with him online before. All right. So if we're trying to explain the forgetting curve and why exactly this happens, just to wrap this all back up, the reason why we're forgetting things all along the way here, why is that we're forgetting things, is because it is a mix of interference and decay. So whenever we take that test after studying 24 hours later, we've experienced a lot of new information, and some of that new information is going to overwrite some of that old information. That could be part of it. And another part of it is that if we're not actively studying and we study once and then kind of don't again, then some of those neurons may be pruned. And so because they're pruned, they no longer have as strong a connection as they did when you were studying earlier. So that is a quick kind of explanation of that. There's a couple ways that we can kind of combat our forgetting natures, and we can combat interference and decay. I would say that three important things here, and these will all come up again in a future unit. Visual imagery. Human beings are pretty good at remembering visual things, not so good at remembering lexical things like words and numbers. So if you can, try to visualize what you're trying to remember. So if you're, and that's why I was saying, like, Ebbinghaus wouldn't let himself remember the word cat or dog, because you could easily visualize that, and that can help fight transience and forgetting. The second piece is to try to make that information meaningful to you. Whenever something is meaningful to you, it is encoded and processed at a deeper level. Your brain handles it differently. We'll talk about that in a future unit as well. But if you're trying to remember a list of words, see if you can think about those words in a meaningful way and tie them back to you personally, and maybe imagine you handling them, so that way you're visualizing it as well. And then finally, mnemonics. And mnemonics are like using things like abbreviations or other kinds of retrieval cues to help you remember more complicated things. So an example would be like PEMDAS, right? So this is the order of operations in math, PEMDAS. I was taught it was please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, because that stands for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, right? And so that is an example of using a really simple stimulus to help us draw out and retrieve a more complex, complicated one. So these three things can help us fight the natural kind of forgetting tendencies that we have. And that's all that I have for you here today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you later. And actually, because you waited so long here, I am going to give you a treat. I'm going to show you a video of my dog. So you see my dog over there. He's sitting over there by the trash can. He looks like he's sleeping. But I have a secret for you. We are not alone. So give me 5 seconds here. Come here. Sorry, I got a really sleepy boy. He was going boneless for a second. I don't know if you can see him. This is Hopper. Say hello, Hopper. Does he look happy or does he look sleepy? So Hopper was sleeping under my desk the entire time. Please do not tell my spouse this, because she loves this dog so much. She loves him more than me, maybe. And she would be upset to know that he was cuddling with me this whole time that I was recording this. But I showed you my dogs, and maybe... Thank you. Thank you for being so tolerant. So maybe next video I will show you that one that's over there sleeping in the back. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll try to give you another surprise at the end of the next video, just for those of you that are tuning in towards the very, very end. See you later. Bye-bye.